Hello everyone, today we talk about the cultural renewal of the 12th century, a topic that we already discussed under the name of the 12th century Renaissance as it's also called. That today, however, we will be looking at chiefly from the writing and reading point of view, right? And it's really about the written texts that represents the principal instrument of work of the historians that in Europe in this century start multiplying, or starting from this century, telling the truth. This is a concept that I've been struggling with ever since I discovered actually that there is a wide struggling for, actually not with, but since I discovered that so many people are really convinced that the Middle Ages didn't basically have any intellectual movement or dynamism, or that there is a story of the development of a continent, of a civilization. Many times I've heard people substantially stating that up to the Renaissance, I mean the 15th century one, Europe was just like a dark hole. Nobody read, books were not used, were not read, just stored, right? I take this fundamentally as a declaration of illiteracy, meaning that a person who has such prejudices fundamentally doesn't know anything about not just the Middle Ages but about history in general. And I presume that this happens, of course, because of several reasons that we can't discuss today, however, that are deeply rooted sometimes into this idea that fundamentally you take some manual to make a civilization grow, right? If you don't have, like, the theory from which this starts is that if Europeans hadn't started reading stuff from, like, in Western Europe from the East, from the Byzantine refugees that fled from the Ottomans, etc., there would have not been a Renaissance. That Europe up to this point was like nothing. And what is said is actually historical evidence is that Europe by that time was already actually more advanced than the East at that point. Like as a system overall, in terms of intellectual, technological, scientific development overall, Western Europe had already was taking off really, and had by far surpassed that same. And when we look at such legacy, that of course doesn't have to be underestimated, even for the Renaissance of the Greco-Roman works that were that came back in a certain sense from the East in certain areas. Europe after fundamentally the 14th century, 15th century. First of all, you realize that the Europeans already knew about this stuff largely, and that since previous centuries they had gone to the East physically, like physical individuals, to take those books and bringing them back to Europe, writing them. We discussed a lot of times the translation school of Toledo. We discussed the Italian merchants who went into the East and took this stuff in massive quantity. And we observed how the actual moment of surpass, if we can define it like this, is actually the 12th century. Like in the 12th century, there is a moment in which Western Europe develops at one point that nor the Byzantine world nor the Islamic world as a whole for some time will be able to match, right? In terms not just of growth but of expansion, meant as literally the ability not just to augment in number but in quality, like in developing a system that is at the base of modern Europe. Like what we sometimes refuse to recognize is that what we call modern Europe is actually an immediate product of medieval civilization, right? Modern Europe is born into the Middle Ages. Not metaphorically, not like with confusion with the timeline. I mean, it's literally like that. Actually, the same medieval civilization that has developed at one point that doesn't quite erase what existed before, but simply built upon it, which is a different concept. So this is a set of perspectives that I think the average medieval history, but the average person, I would say, should know. I mean, these things I personally learned them at school. Like, it's not that I even had to go to university to learn them. The point is, however, that a large part of our Western world still lacks any orientation, any orientation relative to these matters. And I find it astonishing. Like, how can in 2019, 2020, almost, a person believe that the Middle Ages fundamentally were just nothing but a dark hole, intellectually speaking, is, I mean, from my perspective, is fundamentally unbelievable, right? And it's actually a very, is a symptom of a very deep malaise that we're living into our world, right? These are things that are normally taught in universities today. Why is that? Broadly speaking, society hasn't absorbed them yet, right? This is not like material that you have to struggle to understand. This is something you can't even read from a simple history manual, right? And yet, nobody cares, right? More than not knowing, really not caring. We're not talking about the immense accomplishments of medieval intellectual activity in so many ways. Like, think about universalism, scholastics, its philosophy, that you can't even just make it start from the 12th century. Is a great stream, a great flow that comes straight from the ancient world, that passes even through early medieval times, and that flourishes once again in this moment, in this period. And in this world in this thinking are contained actually certain features of our own civilization that eventually were simply elaborated and developed further, but the bases were already there. We're talking also about concepts as tolerance, as the equality of human beings, like the relation with science, with the world, with the natural world. So how can we sometimes proclaim like our superiority towards a world that is actually the same one that taught us such things, right? It's basically, I don't want to make it, especially for what is said before, relatively to like Western Europe isolated as a monad, but that's also myth. Like, it's obvious that without, in fact, the Mediterranean dimension, Constantinople, Islam, there would have not been what we call the Renaissance in the same measure, in the same, even the same quality that we experienced eventually. And I don't want to make it a clash of civilizations, but rather a meeting point of civilization. In this sense, especially in the 12th century, 13th century, if you look at Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, you realize that even the scientific basis, the philosophical basis, even in general the cultural basis, broadly meant as reading material, were the same. That these were worlds and cultures that developed together, right? And that's also why I don't like to stress certain sharp, like the idea of contrast. There is much more of a meeting ground than a contrast ground, right? And this is not just like a perspective once again. This is literally how it happened, meaning that even warfare is not was normal at the time, but it's something also you can't prolong for too long, like, because there weren't resources. Well, there were resources for exchange, for trade, for knowing, and probably also the overlooking of a Mediterranean dimension that exists a little bit into the West, because it is easily explainable, because there are certain countries that developed kind of a more resounding historiography that are located maybe not just in the Mediterranean, so they try to concentrate more this shifted perspective, geographically speaking. But what happens in the Mediterranean at this point is fundamental, right? And has also to be understood. To reduce it like, we were Europeans, like, against all these other guys out there. No, it doesn't make any sense on any ground for what we know in history of literature, of really, like, it's evident the contrary, right? And aside from this, however, really, I still believe that the reason why we call ourselves as Westerners, with all the limits of this definition, and even with the bias that can derive from it, but we are like this, objectively, I think, is born at this point, and it's very characteristic. It's very unique because it has an expansive force, right, that we have tried to describe. Once again, not because we have to propagandate that, I don't know, the West was like, it's not a competition between our civilizations, but it's objectively the realization that what was developed in the West at that time starts being extremely, let's say, productive, fertile, expansive, in fact, from the 12th century proper. The 12th century is a moment of great transformation. There have been even certain provoking works recently that challenging a little bit this idea of progress fundamentally attached to it. In fact, the 12th century Renaissance and so on wanted to stress the crisis of it, like also the darker aspects, even especially in the structuration of more central powers and the effect that this had on society. There's always kind of a dark side in the process at all times, but the fact that it's controversial makes it more interesting, makes it more meaningful in many ways, because if we are born from there, we can understand very much about certain kind of genetic features that belong to our culture, right? And the 12th century is an extremely fascinating century. It's the moment in which this sleepy Europe, we can't say that, had fallen into the state of kind of dreamlike state, like of the early Middle Ages, starts recuperating its self-consciousness, its dynamism, its active, proactive attitude at the rest of the world, starts taking once again the reins of its own direction, of its own orientation. And once again, it's tough. It's not an easy process. It passes through even very dramatic events, right? Without talking about strictly like the Crusades in themselves that are a history of conflict, but think also about the in fact other areas like the expansion of feudal power and the progressive coordination and framing of the peasant communities and their direction, and yet it's a moment of great growth also for other communities that escape to this order, that rise within it, but in a quite autonomous way. There are the cities chiefly, but also other, like broadly speaking, also other classes, if you want, right? And looking at the literary element of it, the literature of the story, if you look at the produced sources, there is a real explosion, right, that is easily perceivable, especially when you look at the catalogs of libraries and the inventories of the archives, right? You that marks a very important process, the revival of a culturally lay tradition, right? This is very important. The rise of a lay historiography, literature, and through which we are able to look at that world in a way that up to that point, in fact, hadn't quite emerged, right? We know that early medieval times, high medieval times were actually very dynamic, right? It's just that we don't know much about them, right? But for their own standards, they had actually a lot of transformation, a lot of developments that were quite important for this same world, by the way. But for the first time in the 12th century, we have, especially in certain areas of Europe, and that's why I emphasize the Mediterranean dimension, because that's where it starts largely. But not only, right? The key countries, I would say, are Italy and France. Like, those are the ones that represent two very different models, but that's where the main forces, the main energies start transforming actively the system and expand. It's like waves, like an emanation, right, that starts permeating the whole European continent. And they won't stop, because such things will go on for like several centuries, up to the late modern age, from these same areas in part and beyond, especially with France. But it's it starts as a model, right? And what you can see here is the end of the ecclesiastical monopoly on the production and the preservation of written material, right? So it's not a conflict. Like, there is partly a conflict also in the process, because naturally the church doesn't want to give up this monopolium in part, but it finds itself in a world where you can't really impose much. Like, the coercive capabilities of these powers were extremely limited at the time. And paradoxically, the same church produces some of the greatest accomplishments in Western civilization, exactly through coping with the unexpected, coping with the heresies, responding with this great, enormous system that is scholastics, that is the triumph of a scientific and universalistic and rationalistic look at the world, right, through the integration of Aristotle into the equation, let's say, while, as you know, in previous centuries, especially in the West, it had been St. Augustine and Platonism, Neoplatonism, that had fundamentally the greater role, the greater cultural impact. And that sets the basis for something which today maybe we tend to think that happened very late in time to this, and in a very distant and different context, but that took place really at that point. As Christianity always had, since its very beginning, in nuce, let's say, the distinction between state and church. Like, it wasn't conceived as a, like, the two things couldn't be together. As a matter of fact, they had to be together, right? At this point, it was a Christian empire that couldn't exist without the church, and vice versa. Or better, not really vice versa, because the church could always had a more, let's say, totalizing idea of itself. Like, the church is immortal, right? Of course, but the empire exists too as a consequence. Like, as long as there is a human society, and through revelation, the church exists. The church cannot exist without an empire as well, right? So, aside from the survivalistic perspective of the church in itself, but the relation with the empire is very well outlined at this point. The clash of investitures is an immense pivot for the development of a political theory, of the revival of Roman law, the necessity of enriching the intellectual tools, and in building this great cathedral that universalism represents, right? And that is meant to hold the world, but at the same time defines clearly what is the church, what is the state. And objectively, what will happen in the second half of the 17th century was, I would say, a natural consequence at that point. Like, this division that becomes more marked and is accompanied also by an emergence of tolerance, like we mean it in the modern sense, but is fundamentally a Christian concept that, remember, that it didn't exist before. Like before Christianity, Europe was ultra religious, in the sense paganism was all one with reality itself, right? Christianity goes beyond this in a different perspective, in a different dimension. It adds even a concept of history that is essentially the one we still have, right? A linear history, or time where there is a beginning and an end, and where therefore there is a relativization of what happens at a single moment, because the end is more important of what happens currently. So today we're also able to look at history in perspective thanks to this, because before it was just a cyclical idea of a world basically stayed together for an infinite time, with a meaning that was represented by this cycle, but that men didn't look beyond of, right? Because that was the cornerstone of reality, right? Christianity goes beyond. It tells there is a reality that we don't understand, and that therefore what happens in here is gonna change, right? And there is something beyond that we can't fully understand, but that we have to take into consideration. And what we have in this world, however, is important, is meaningful in function of that, so that you don't have to refuse to know the world. Basically, the duty of a Christian is to be a scientist, because without understanding of the world, of its nature, there can't be any Christian responsibility. God entrusted the world to mankind to keep it, to preserve it in a godlike function, right? Mankind has this divine, it's kind of like an hypothesis of in fact, of the anthropomorphic God. And the relation that exists between God and mankind is the same that exists between mankind and the creation that God created, in fact, for mankind. So hence were the like universalism and scholastics, the Aristotelic and Thomistic system is the scientific and rationalistic answer of Christianity in the High Middle Ages to interpret the world, and to and feeling this as a need, right, and putting certain limits that are not let's say limiting limits, like they don't bring to an end of investigation, but are the conceptually, philosophically speaking, the same function, that are the same grounds upon which knowledge, understanding, science can be grounded, right? It's like if you study Kant, that's the same thing. It's like recognizing that there is a limit, that what we can know is practically infinite, but that still has some boundaries that are incidentally the same boundaries of our biological structure, fundamentally. But within these boundaries, in a human dimension, therefore, we can accomplish what it takes to make the right choice, right? So this idea that there is a conscience that is entrusted to that, the idea that it all starts from the individual. That's why we talk about the 12th century humanism, and in this sense of a kind of a renaissance, also a scientific renaissance, because it's based on knowledge, it's based on the positive, on the active role of mankind. Think about the Bamberger Ritter, and what that man represents in a statue that shows you a man that in all of his dimension, from the top of his horse, that looks at the world, and looks at the world in one of the most human ways, that is aimed at that is careless. It's let's say it's I don't know how to explain this, but let's say it's looking beyond, right? It's not concentrated on a mere local contingent function, immediately exhaustible. He's looking beyond. He's looking at the true meaning of the world, and that's why the 12th century is very important. You can find in art, in architecture, the even the evolution of the relation with between man and God. Like in the previous times in Romanesque art, there was a very pragmatic, very, if we want, flat idea of what it was. It was a story. The Romanesque church was a storytelling place, fundamentally, where the believers were admonished of the last judgment, of the ultimate end. There was an emotionalistic approach to the fear of the avenging God, like of the punishing God. 12th century reveals a God that is increasingly instead is more benign, is anthropomorphic. It tells you what mankind can do within the boundaries that God has established, which is very important, which is extremely empowering, and it reflects, of course, the extreme intellectual development that is happening at this time. Here, there are more people who can write, and not just the elite, as we will see now in a while. It's a true renaissance. It's a true step forward that the previous centuries had favored but had not quite achieved. Right? And the late cultural tradition opens this other branch that will be, if you want, at the base of the second of the Renaissance of the early modern times. Let's say that is different because it's secular, and this is very important. That opens to, if you want, not really to an atheistic view of the world, but let's say at an objective take on storytelling, which is different from what still, however, at this time historiography was about. Right? It was chiefly, as long, in fact, as history is written by the clerics, it's still bent to what to the version that these ecclesiastics wanted to depict on behalf of someone that had commissioned this. And there is this great distrust towards, for example, chronicles, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, because objectively at this point, Anglo-Saxon, if you look at English literature, well, there was a very few of lay culture in historiography, and therefore there is this distrust towards the chronicler, the guy that just writes, because in other areas of Europe at this point there is literally an explosion of lay culture that by the 13th to the 14th century especially will massively overwhelm the religious one at every level. Like, it goes past beyond. And that is said extremely important, and begins at this time, though. It can be observed, and it's very reliable instead, because it's written not because there was a king who was commissioning that, but because these were free citizens, who were people who were writing, obviously with their own bias, with their own agenda, but talking to a community that was much freer, much more open, much more literate, for example. And therefore it had to be more reliable, it had to be realistic. It was not the panegyric of a king or his deeds. It was about telling, look, this year that thing happened, we have to mind about that, because it's part of our history and it had an impact and it changed society. And that's where we can start looking at the world through a different lens that is not meant to be symbolic, like largely the same scholastic had needed to be, but it starts looking at the crude reality, right, as we can, and that's an extremely honest historiography for the time standards, because it doesn't conceal like the defeat, the failure, the sufferance. It tells the story as as things happen, not as they should have been. And today maybe I am digressing too much, but this is an extremely important step. We'll talk more about lay historiography in the future, right? And never underestimate certain areas of Europe that produced so much. And also in here, nobody seems to really care about. Never think that a kingdom by itself is more historically productive than a city-state, because it's not really it's not really true. So all these novelties are at the base of a series of phenomena that, while distinct, are however connected to the widening of the number of people that can read, besides the circle of the clerks, right, of the clergy. And the origin of universities, for example, the rediscovery of Roman law and of Hellenic knowledge, also the development of vernacular, also of Neo-Latin languages at this time, is really important, and it changes the face of European knowledge. And it's the proof, if anything, not much of a cause, but a consequence of a progress that had taken place. It was largely structural, and of which this wealth was one of the major consequences. In order to understand this change, two factors, in my opinion, and in general, have to be considered, right? Must be considered. In first place, the economical growth that began roughly in Carolingian times, by the 8th century, even before. It depends on where you look, because it happens even beyond Carolingian borders, right? So it's a massive growth that starts. I mean, it's massive on the long run. You can't start seeing at that point. That invests also, like the Byzantine East, also Islam, and therefore produces great changes, in those, great revivals also in those worlds, right? So it's think about the Macedonian Reconquest or the Seljuk Empire and all these things. So in the first place, we've seen this economical growth, right? That widened the exchanges, made society more complex, and triggered the need to fix by writing simply rights, transactions, and solutions of conflicts, and that made emerging the necessity to mark the differences between groups of new formation. This is very important because once again, the modernistic prejudices make you think that things like state, bureaucracy, even professionalism, somewhat started later on, right? That it all starts with the modern age, right? Before there was nothing. It's really here that begins. And if we really want to be honest, there's always a part of this development, historically speaking. The Middle Ages were particularly innovative by certain standards, but they were also developing certain dynamics that all societies more or less have. So when you look at these groups that were taking shape, you have to consider the second factor, that is the political territorial recomposition due to organisms that were different time after time. You have monarchies, right? Communes, principalities, papacy, empire, right? So Europe, from a political territorial point of view, is still a mess, right? The monarchies that are developing now are still very fragmented, still have a very decentralized system, but they're more centralized than they were before. So it's really a matter of which standard you take. So you can't say that in this world there is no centralization. You can't say that when feudalism develops, that's the apex of decentralization. That's false. With feudalism, there is already a structuration of a system that could have not existed if it had been a merely decentralized power, because there would have not been any centralization of sort, like for saying that a monarchy could control now much wider areas. So what happens in the 12th century is that pretty much everywhere, by different degrees, were created groups of functionaries that largely employed writing for bureaucratic aims, right? People say, oh no, the typical modernistic-minded person say, oh no, bureaucracy is a term that is invented in the 18th century to define the development that those modern state bureaucracy already existed. It wasn't called like that, call it whatever you like, call it pig, call it, I don't know, map, whatever. What we know as bureaucracy really existed. It was developed in the Middle Ages, and it already existed before, of course, in some places, in some areas. If we're talking about the Latin Germanic West, as we're doing today, we're talking, of course, of a development that takes place roughly right now. But if you look at the Byzantine Empire, that had always had it. Even if you look at early medieval powers such as Umayyad Spain, you can see that there was a bureaucracy there as well. So these are not models that are invented by the modern age, right? Bureaucracy, if you look at 14th century France and actually 14th century papacy, those are the countries that make modern bureaucracy being born. The Angevins and the papacy, right? Preferably in degree of importance, the papacy and the Angevins, right? And it starts there. We're talking about lots of people. We're talking about chancellors, but this that produce an enormous amount of sources, of material, of written documents. Go tell that in the Middle Ages they didn't have bureaucracy. Look at what those sources are. Study the relative historiography that exists about them, and then we'll talk about that once again. Also because from the 12th century and the 13th also especially, there is such an enormous flow of trade that basically in here nobody had ever seen before. Like the wealth, in fact, that is pouring. Why the papacy and Angevin France, according to you? Why did we mention Italy and France before? Because these were the countries that had most of European wealth in their hands. And that's where they start developing effective ways to manage that by developing bureaucracy, in fact, right? So in Laponia, you won't find that, you know. But no, every society develops for what it is, right? So it's not a matter, once again, it's not a ranking matter. You know, it's not a competitive matter. This is simply assessing that the Middle Ages is not a flat land, and that it is a violently dynamic system that we can't even imagine most of the time. So what it really was, because also the sources are fairly limited, right? But we do see from several hints that this system was putting in motion an amount of resources that was unprecedented, historically speaking, especially in those geographical areas. Like, not even in Roman times, certain production had existed in that manner. Of course, this depends also what we're talking about strictly, because once again, these are two systems. So also comparing them makes sense up to a certain point. But objectively, Europe has a much bigger potential at this point than it had during ancient times. I mean, this is obvious. There are certain areas of Central Europe, Northern Europe especially, that are growing and expanding at an incredible rate, right? As we've seen, Southern Europe, the Mediterranean, was already fairly advanced. But if you consider that in the ancient world, like Central and East and Northern Europe were kind of like the third world, what they managed to accomplish in 1,000 years in the Middle Ages is incredible. is really incredible. I personally don't know any other maybe I'm ignorant, surely, but I don't know any other context where there was such a speedy growth in parallel terms in those same times, right? Because and so structural, so massive. Like, of course, in relative terms, right? Not in quantitative terms, because of course, also those lands remained relatively, lagging behind for a while. But still, and this is an interconnected system. This is what we have to stress when people believe that the Middle Ages were essentially a place where everybody, a time in history where everybody thought about just their own backyard, like that everything was concentrated locally, that people didn't know, that people didn't travel. Basically, you can't study the history of a single European country in the Middle Ages without studying the rest of the world continent history, because the history of that single country without the rest basically has no meaning at all by itself. This world is so deeply intertwined, interconnected, and that everything derives from this net of relations, and it can't be interpreted just in a localistic base. Like, of course, Western historiography, especially like in the 19th century, etc., wanted to stress nationalism and the fact that basically the Middle Ages were a moment of revival, which in part was also positive, of course, because otherwise there were still this kind of Enlightenment, kind of neoclassical approaches to the Middle Ages, for which that spread all of this ignorance about the alleged darkness of the Middle Ages. But at the same time, the nationalism stressed the fact that every people was kind of special in its own regard. It was unique, that it grew because it was that single people. No, it didn't happen like that. This system was sometimes even at a transcontinental range of interaction, right? How can you understand the history of 13th century Europe if you don't understand the Mongolian Empire and the trade balance between, the traffics between Europe and China? What's the point in the first place? It's that messed up, if you want, to explain, right? Because it's not easy to frame in a whole generalizing explanation, exactly because the Middle Ages are still largely taught in this kind of localistic fashion, because objectively we have an enormous amount of sources in the Middle Ages that is impressive. Like, you can't end to study the Middle Ages. Like, for the ancient world, we have just those 2 or 3 sources for a certain topic in archaeology, but there is no comparison. The Middle Ages is like a massive overflow of sources of production. It's the explosion of a continent, right? And this all passes through writing, right? Through and reading as well, right? And always given that these activities were very different from the ones the same ones that we do today, right? Writing and reading is almost disappearing fundamentally. People seem not to be able to write anymore, like to write even a simple sentence, or to read meaning to understand what they read. These are statistics. I was reading them also today, incidentally. Students in schools, like they read, but they don't understand what they read. I mean, this is astonishing, right? And this is even more astonishing if you consider that for millennia, humans have struggled to reach a satisfactory position, spitting blood, in order to have the privilege of reading and of knowing. Today we have basically the world knowledge available, a click away from us, and we don't give a damn about that, right? There has been a drastic disruption of all the systems of learning that we had built upon the last millennia. And in the Middle Ages, reading and writing was pure luxury, right? It was something that people craved for more than in any other single historical period. Like, there's never been a single historical period in which people have had the inexhaustible thirst of knowledge like in the Middle Ages. In the ancient world, it wasn't like that. It was much more of a kind of a compilatory or pragmatic oriented necessity. Even in the Enlightenment, in modern age, it wasn't much about actually knowing, but about categorizing information, and we are largely heirs of that tradition. In the Middle Ages, people learned because knowledge was wealth, because knowledge was precious, because knowledge was an eye opener to the world, beyond what you can see, what you can feel, right? It was a transcendental knowledge, right? It's also difficult to generalize, because of course the Middle Ages is quite diverse in its own regard. It's obvious that for a very long time most of the Middle Ages were characterized by literacy, right? Up to like the industrial age, like with pre-industrial societies, it was fundamentally like that. But here there is a qualitative improvement. This is the point. And in order to understand this better, we have also to look back at what the past had been about, because in the past, the same groups that were producing knowledge and were writing for themselves, from this audience, for this public, fundamentally, that was interested to new literary genres, hadn't existed, right? So what we really have to look back at is the so-called Carolingian Renaissance, right? That I think we discussed once on Schwerpunkt, to observe that actually Carolingian times were extremely important for culture overall, but they were not much like in the way we intended as a general progress of society, right? As instead was happening in the 12th century. For example, Jacques Le Goff wrote regarding to the Carolingian times that these had not had any quantitative aspect that was tied for us to the notion of rebirth, of revival, or of renaissance, in other words. If we look at the circle of intellectuals that were reunited at the court of Charlemagne and the one of his successors, you can observe that, for example, classical Latin studies had been revived, yes, but that was more kind of an emergency need, right, to better the grammar competence, and contributing very limitedly to the widening of the number of kind of cultured people, right? It was a very elitary process. Also, Saxon Germany had been important for this. We talked a lot about Saxon Germany. We even created a playlist about the Ottonian dynasty. If you're interested, you can find it in the playlist section. And we observed how the structuration of the empire, especially in the West, in relation with the Byzantine one, had further enhanced this, especially theoretical speculation relatively to politics, to the prerogatives of the imperial power, and so on, and had started producing, very interesting materials, right? But all of these transformations essentially had remained within the Palatine Cenaculum, right? The elitary character of knowledge, I mean the really structured knowledge, wasn't spread among like larger groups. Books remained extremely precious and costly objects, right? Having a book like in the 9th century was like having, I don't know, a car today. Like it was, but not even, probably even more. It also depends which kind of books, telling the truth. It was an enormous asset. It was extremely costly. If anything, even just, let's leave aside the contents, but thinking even just how a book was built. Like you needed a slaughter of tens, if not thousands of sheep to produce a book. So what happens in the 12th century, even with the development of paper, so that came from China via Islam, into places like Spain first, Italy later, and then the rest of Europe, changed a lot the way, like knowledge could be spread. Like Gutenberg made the big deal in the 15th century with print, but that also was an accomplishment of a lot that had gone on in the Middle Ages and in the forms of written production that owed a lot even to these technicalities, etc. But these technicalities in turn are, in fact, a consequence of a massive political and cultural change that starts occurring with the revival of the year 1000, especially within the 12th century. Before these books were even, we often underestimate what the sacral relation with the written world was. I mean, if you take Central Europe, like in the 9th century, in the 10th century, well, you don't have to think about a world that was particularly distant from the one of a few centuries before. Books had a sort of reverential and magic function for many people. Like other objects had like swords, etc. Those were not words like our own, where we look at objects and say, "Oh, well, this is just an ensemble of substance, of atoms, etc." Objects had a kind of a ghost on their own, right? So, and books, and especially sacred books like the Bible, that naturally was the most produced work, and were containers of great wealth and great power as well, right? And that could change the way people thought, right? And that's why even the revival of the 12th century passes controversially through clashes. I mean, the fact there have been things like, I don't know, the Crusades, or the struggle for investitures, or the clashes between the German emperors and the Lombard League, produced in these worlds an incredible intellectual production, right? These people had to justify what they were doing. They had to explain what this whole thing was about. They had to assert their own their own prerogatives, their own rights. The revival of Roman law. The revival of Roman law emerges from a necessity of this world to regulate itself. It wasn't much because of the later reverence that was attributed to Roman law, like it would happen in European universities since the 14th century, with a sort of scolarization of the system that eventually will enter into the Ancien Regime and in the Romanist school of law. Roman law was recovered because it had fundamentally to fill the gaps of what the local, ethnic, and feudal laws lacked, because they had been built when societies were simpler, and now kind of a more Roman-like society was being developed at that level of complexity. So what happens in the 12th century is a massive change, and talking about Carolingian Renaissance, I wouldn't like to leave you with the impression that was all bad. Actually, the Carolingian Renaissance is often, at least for whoever still uses this concept, this definition, is generally a sum of different considerations that have to do not just with the literary production, but with the empire itself. So the Carolingian Empire didn't bring to a particular improvement in the average life. Like this was a moment of harsh, even social unbalancement and certification of society, of insecurity, of wars, of slaughters, civil wars. I mean, and yet the greatest accomplishment of the Carolingian Empire was incredible. Frankly, it was literally incredible. Like, if you think that was started in the 8th and the 9th century, you don't believe it. It was the system of education, right? That the Franks had started in order to cope with the ignorance of their own clergy, because their kingdom and later empire was Christian, but it's not that the local clergy even knew how to speak Latin correctly, and that's why classic letters are recovered in Carolingian times. But there is more than that. There is a cooperation of the empire with the church, and especially monastic centers, to regulate education. And there is an enormous emphasis placed on this, especially by Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, that were really enlightened sovereigns for the time, who understood perfectly well what this could mean, because it wasn't about just like teaching the clergy. It was literally creating through that a bureaucracy of clerics that could read and write and keep the empire together. Unfortunately, this failed because the empire crumbled for other reasons that were largely internal. But what survived into the 9th and the 10th century up to the 11th was this impressive monastic net of culture that even went beyond the Carolingian world, because it also invested culturally places like Anglo-Saxon England, for example. It went beyond that made Europe surviving as a connected tissue, even into the toughest moment of the second invasions, right? What kept communication between Europe and sharing a common culture, a common script by the 12th century. Europeans write all with the same script, basically. It's the Carolina, readapted in a proto-Gothic or now almost Gothic form, that everybody can read, right? Before the Carolingians, a Visigoth from Spain or an Anglo-Saxon from England, or a Longobard from Italy, or a Frank from Gaul, could barely read each other's scripts, because they were different peoples. The Carolingian Empire sets the basis for this unification of European culture through writing, right, and through knowledge as a consequence. And this is really impressive. So when we talk now about the creation of a lay historiography, this surpassed the evolution from a merely ecclesiastical literary production. We have to understand, however, that the thing, not in antagonistic terms, but like saying, that 12th century Europe has to thank what had happened before as well. But a lot changes now, again, right? So to the quantitative growth of the number of literate people, and to the connected widening of the group of intellectuals, you can see a qualitative change as well, right? For example, since the end of the Roman scholastic system, had emerged some forms of imperfect literacy, which means that some people could, for example, write only their own name. Other people knew how to write, but they couldn't read, which is very strange to us because today we are literate after all. But you would think like that reading is easier than writing. We're actually not, and of course it depends on what you have to do with it. But in the Middle Ages, it was very common to know how to write, but not how to read. Which also tells you how certain activities were like instrumental to others, and what their limits were, what their aims were. Right? The same monks, for example, that copied the texts through which classical civilization was saved, in part, proceeded through a sort of commixtion between reading and learning by heart, the so-called ruminatio, which in Latin means literally chewing, right? Because it's this repetition that you speak like that, you remember, you repeat, so it sounds like chewing, right? And that, however, had a few to do with the notion of reading that is familiar to us today, right? So very different worlds. There were people who knew the Bible by heart, right? Now, I don't know how many of you have read the Bible, entirely, but it's a pretty massive thing. In the Middle Ages, there were people. It was fundamentally rare. There were ecclesiastics, but they knew the Bible by heart, and some others that surely knew much more by heart. This is something you can still see in the Renaissance later on with these polymaths that knew basically the entire knowledge of the time. Of course, there was much less to know compared to today, but this is something to which our brains today are completely that they're not completely not used to, but that theoretically we could make work in that way. Right, especially since this began when you were a child, so obviously your brain is much more malleable than just know by your 24th birthday you're already too old to remember a big deal of things. So that's how our brain works. But it was also a habit for many, and it was this idea that, given that books costed so much, as we have seen, well, learning by heart was a pretty convenient thing to do, economically speaking, because you could remember so much just storing like all the information in your head, which you can do. Humans brutally underestimate what they can do with their brain, and these people were forced to learn in such fashion, demonstrate this to us. So never think that you are more capable, right, or more intelligent than a person that lived in the 12th century, because most likely you're not, right? Especially if you spent your entire life glued to a smartphone. Right? So from the 12th century, the book became an instrument that was made to be read and used, not anymore just exposed or admired, right? Remember that some books had basically not a very different function to the one of jewelry. Some of them were, that from the 4th century in codicology, we say that the book is closed. Like all the representation of books are not what is written inside of them, but their cover that was like jammed, excuse me, out with precious stones, etc. That had to do more with a status symbol than with the actual function of reading, right? Because people had impoverished and they couldn't read anymore. They had to work their land, right? So in the 12th century, people get rich once again. So there are more people who can, there is enough surplus for making certain people learn and using them, right? This was not pastime. This was a job. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. This wealth this knowledge produced wealth, right? Because it was used, as we've seen before. If the emperor had to stress his own prerogatives in front of the papacy, or vice versa, there had to be skilled lawyers and intellectuals and theorists who knew how to debate this, even publicly speaking, because always remember that at this time, even official communication sometimes was public, was vocal, was oral, right? Propaganda, like that's all lost because it wasn't written down most of the cases. But this was still a very public world where people kind of knew each other, and proclaims. There were also fewer people, so proclaims had an official value. Even legally speaking, people just swore like they had to produce, just men of trust who would testify for them, and then that was an intrinsic value that person had spoken publicly and in front of the others, and there was a concrete value attached to it, not just like today, which speaking is like cheap, right? What does it matter, a word or not? People, I have the impression, frankly, that people in the past spoke much less than today. Just think about it. Just think about what the demographic density was, and the general simplicity of the lack of kind of theoretically based professions. People would speak incredibly rarely, and at least in certain areas, just think about, 11th century Scandinavia. How do you think an average or even 12th century Scandinavia would speak for, like in those lands and spaces? But words in this sense were more carefully chosen. So language was much more precious in itself. And people would think, even in a legal function, to say things that mattered. Always remember that Europeans were coming from a pagan past, where telling the truth was considered like a moral value. Not for reasons of fair play. Of course, there was a kind of a social contract related to that as well. But it was really believed that if you said something false, like bad things could happen to you and to your community. So people cared much more about their own words, and they came to acquire much heavier specific weight than it is the one we give today. So in the 12th century, this process starts changing, where there was the multiplication of the textual devices aimed at, for example, finding rapidly the single passages in the text. These are all technicalities, like was the introduction of titles to distinguish certain characters, to distinguish certain chapters, with different characters and colors, for example. But also, of course, besides chapters, paragraphs, sub-paragraphs, and there was the introduction of marginal notes that were disposed on all over the four margins of the page. There were indexes in books now. They were systematic and alphabetic. Before, they hadn't existed. There were certain kind of indicators, sometimes like drawn like little hands pointing at, I don't know, a certain important part on the text that you needed to focus on. If you take a medieval manuscript, you start reading, you will very often find that from the 12th century onwards, things like these. So this didn't just facilitate reading the text as such, but they rendered also simpler the use of the book in a kind of a selective writing fashion, meaning that there were new ways of storing and selecting texts, like anthologies, hundreds, and summaries. So in many ways, culture begins to specialize, to systematize, to structurate itself. The process equates naturally to a different approach to knowledge and the need to create something that goes beyond the same text. There are structures, there are entire philosophical, theoretical systems that are built upon the sources that are available, and it starts being increasingly more available because an enormous amount of texts are pouring from the East, and Europeans want to know them at all cost. They start translating them all, which means also that they knew Arab, that they knew Hebrew, right? So when you realize what was happening, you realize that this society was already at the same level of that culture that was being assimilated, and not the other way around. Never buy into the technologistic stereotype that everybody falls into, believing that in order to grow you need a book, you need a manual. When these translations start, it's because Europeans are already as cultured as those books need. Because if you're not, you don't need those books. Because you can't read them, you can't appreciate them, you don't know what to do with them. In fact, what Europeans were searching for at that point was not a way to tell them what to do, but it was searching for a complexion, like a broader, like an expansion of things that were already mastering by their own selves, especially on the technological point of view. The myth that this renaissance on the long run was triggered by books that came from the East is today considered by every academic work that I read on the matter, completely false. Like, there is not a single evidence of that. That is, if anything, a symptom that the West had now already reached what was on the other side. It was surpassing it, because the 12th century is the century where you have such things. And you have the Western heavy cavalry manages to break the Turkish one in the Crusades, where Italian navies and ships were better than Byzantine ones that were taking over the empire. You see that what had occurred in the previous centuries that are relatively poorly documented tells you that these guys had gone far beyond already by themselves. They didn't need to learn from those guys. They just needed to perfect what they had already found out by themselves. Right? If we reasoned as if we need a book to progress, at this point we would still be primitives of the caves. Because guess what? You need books, someone else to teach you. No. This is not how it works. Nobody tells you, nobody denies that books can help you to do that. That's what manuals are for. But manuals are for people who are already in the condition of applicating what they learn from those manuals. Right? Even just as a spin-off that's why we read certain books at school to learn certain things. But we can afford that because we're already at the level of lifestyle, life quality that is for which it's useful to learn those things in that way, in that stage, right? So it's obvious that sharing information is a way to rise faster. But if you don't have a pre-existing base that allows you to invest resources and to applicate that knowledge, you don't go anywhere. You really don't go anywhere, and that's the real deal here. So I've actually made other videos about this. If you search in medieval society playlist, I've talked a lot about the 12th century, about the translations of this Arab and Greek manuscripts. There's plenty of that, really, and I will probably come back on reading and commenting once again on this stuff because it's crucial. Like, I think it's one of those overlooked defining moments that sometimes are taught you just from the side of, there is that philosopher that studied that thing. No, it's not that elite anymore. It's not that single bishop, it's not the single master. This is starting, especially in certain countries, from common people. Look at how universities are being born this time. How do you think universities were born? That someone founded them from the above? Universities developed by themselves, and eventually they were, of course, backed and paid and supported and recognized by the public authorities that needed, of course, the human resources and also the money if people went to study in certain places and etc. But this was chiefly an autonomy. It came from the below, right? I've made a video here of context that can help understanding the process I made. First of all, 12th century Renaissance and introduction, and it is one. Then I made this other one, 12th century Western translations from Greek and Arabic. That is also what we discussed briefly today. Another one gives you a bit of context also from the materialistic, like an economical point of view. Medieval manufactures and raw materials in the 12th century circa, right? So there is a lot we have still to cover about this period, but in general, you can already look at those videos if you're interested more in this stuff. So, as we were saying at the beginning of the book, such innovations, because this is the right definition, these are innovations. This is not a revolution, right? When you find in history revolution, unless it's like a revolt, like the French Revolution, so yeah, that you can't use it. But when you find the term revolution applied to technology, literature, society, there's no such thing. There's never been any single revolution that has ever been used to define historically a certain phenomenon. These are not revolutions. There's a very long-term changes that went along together with many other ones, right? It's not a revolution. These were same societies that, of course, in chronological time perspective, we can analyze as saying, wow, this was a massive change. Yeah, but still, it was very slow. Like, it was, in absolute terms, it was very slow. And but for those time standards, it wasn't slow at all, right? And we can recognize it today. They partially recognized that themselves at the time, right? But they, of course, had a bit more difficult to frame it in the way as we do it now. And probably they understood, of course, many things that we don't understand today that would be very useful to know. But as we were saying, such innovations in the material disposition of the text, for example, on the page, were strictly intertwined with the birth of a new studying system, scholastics, that was the expression of a new seeds of transmission of knowledge, universities. We will talk about universities as well. Maybe see if I did something about universities I can address you to, because we don't talk about universities much. Okay, here it doesn't work, whatever. But yeah, if you search for Schwerpunkt universities here, like organization of medieval universities, the mendicant orders education and scientific teaching. Yes, that's very important as well, because you see that here education passes also in the hands of people that weren't the traditional ecclesiastical elite. I mean, the same papacy starts using now the mendicant orders to spread knowledge among laymen as well, and scientific knowledge, scientific teaching. The mendicant orders become the carriers of scholastics, right? And recently I also made this video called Development of Lay Schools in the Middle Ages, that also talks about these things a bit more in bit broadly, telling the truth, but still useful for what we discussed today. Okay, so I think for today it's enough. Sorry if I ramble and digress and whatever, but sometimes I also repeat myself. But consider that most of you actually comes on this video from like out of the blue, sometimes without even knowing me. So sometimes I repeat things also because I assume by making these videos all in a row that that there is someone that may not know about what we already discussed, and that's also why I address you to other videos, because I think that you can catch up with what we already said here. However, for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.